Well, good morning.
Thank you,
Happy New
Mike.
Year. It's a pleasure to
Happy New
have you this
Year.
morning, Senator. Um, I'm going to lob one out there and let you go with it to begin our discussion this morning, and that is why are you the best choice for Democrats to beat Donald Trump next year?
The best choice for Democrats is someone who can win and unify this country. And it is someone who can actually bring people with them, not only for the election, but also in how she governs, instead of shutting people out. I think what you saw back in 2016 was a number of people that stayed home from our fired up Democratic base. They weren't as fired up. And then what you also saw was independents either staying home or maybe voting for other people, an array of people, or even moderate Republicans that sometimes vote Democratic and actually did in 2018 actually in this district. Some of them voted for JD, or he wouldn't have come as close, and also in some of the other districts in Iowa. And when you look at my record, number one, I'm from the heartland. It's not flyover country to me. The first committee I asked to be on when I got to the U.S. Senate was the Agriculture Committee, and I am actually one of the most senior members on that committee now and have been involved in the negotiation of 3 farm bills, working on not only commodity crop issues, but also poultry issues and other animal issues that would be very important to this area. I'm well versed in them, avian flu and the like, and I think that that is something new to have in a president, especially when we're seeing so many problems with the farm economy in rural. Secondly, I'm someone that works across the aisle, and I have done that consistently in my career. Everything from having Republican commissioners when I was running for Senate, and I was the county attorney, who either supported me or didn't oppose me because they were my clients and trusted me and gotten to know me, to when I get to the U.S. Senate, having passed over 100 bills with Republicans. The Des Moines Register did a study of the Iowa senators and looked at who had which of the presidential candidates had sponsored like 24 bills with them. I had 18 of them. And Senator Grassley and I, in particular, have passed a number of bills together, including this year a very important bill, which was Grassley-Klobuchar, on farm bankruptcies and how you can allow small farms to stay into business longer. I also have been someone that has won consistently in red and purple districts. I have not lost a congressional district once in 3 elections, and that includes the district that borders Iowa and the district that borders North and South Dakota. I have won it by big margins several times, and I have won in northern Minnesota, where the steelworkers are, and I have won in Michelle Bachmann's district 3 times. And I have done it by simply going not just where it is comfortable, but where it's uncomfortable, by being honest with people, by listening to them and getting things done. And I think that's what we should want in a president. I don't think it should be the loudest voice in the room. I think it's the person that is competent, that's going to have their back. And we are dealing with a president right now that divides people every single day, every single mean tweet. He finds a way to go after immigrants as pawns. He finds a way to belittle people that don't agree with him, even within his own party, even icons, as you have pointed out, like John McCain. He just never stops. And so I just don't think we can tolerate 4 more years of that. And so my hope would be to build the biggest coalition we've ever seen, which includes independents and moderate Republicans. And I am the one on that debate stage of the 5 of us remaining that has a track record to show that I can get it done.
Since you broached that, I'm going to move a question up and ask about civility. We're at an appallingly low level of civility in this country. What can or should the President of the United States do to raise the level of discourse in our country, to lower the temperature?
Well, you start out by not doing any more mean tweets. I don't know what the media will do, but, no more of this 6:30 a.m. Mean things. And then secondly, I think you reach out to people and you go to neighborhoods that need help, and you go to areas of the country, rural areas that have felt neglected, and you make it very clear that I, as a president, would not be the president for half of America. I would be the president for all of America. And I have repeatedly said that if people are tired of the noise and the nonsense in our politics and the extremes, that they have a home with me, and I mean it. And I think so much of that is going to be how you govern. So the first calls that I would make are to the leaders of Congress on both sides, and then I'd call every governor from the moment I got elected to see their perspective, and you bring people in. I think being really clear about priorities is going to be really important, because the president on election night said that he would work on infrastructure, and he hasn't done that in a big way, as we're seeing from the levees and some of the issues that we have in western Iowa. He also has failed to move on immigration reform, which would be in my top 3 priorities. I look at it as an economic issue, and I actually think this is going to seem counterintuitive to people, but I think it is actually an issue that brings people together. I was in the room and watched while Mike Rounds led the efforts to try to save the Dreamers, and also the people who are here on temporary status. There are a number of Republicans that voted for the 2013 immigration bill, which I thought was really strong, and I think that's just one example of what we could be doing to get this done.
And that is an interesting take, that's an issue that brings people together.
I know it is.
It strikes me as one of the most divisive issues.
It is divisive, but it brings people together when it comes to economics. It brings people together if you talk about it in the right way, that you don't want to deport dreamers who came to this country for, from no knowledge of their own. It brings people together when you start saying we need workers in rural areas in our fields, and we need workers in our plants, and we need workers in our hospitals and starting small businesses and things like that. We have a situation where people actually come from other countries and they get a medical degree in the United States of America, and then they often are forced to go back to their own countries to do their residency when we need doctors in the VA in Marshalltown in Iowa, and where we need doctors in rural areas, including right here in Sioux City. And so to me, and I lead that bill, it's called the Conrad 30, named after Kent Conrad, because he first came up with this idea. And Senator Grassley did work with me and get it reauthorized, but I'd like to see it expanded. So my point is, when you ask how can we make things different, 1 is the tone, incredibly important. 2 is to bring back a sense of decency to our politics, to acknowledge that what unites us is so much stronger than what divides us, and that for so many people that I would bring along in this coalition, yeah, it's an economic check, but not everyone's going to agree with everything my party stands for. But what it is a decency check, it is a values check, it is a patriotism check for so many of these voters and these citizens who do not like what this president says. And the third thing is where I got to immigration reform, is making really clear about these priorities that we have as a country, bringing down the cost of prescription drugs, doing something to making it easier to connect our education system with our economy. And once you do that and you have a clear course on a number of these issues, you get Republicans to go with you. On some of them, you don't. And that's when you use the bully pulpit. But I have been there long enough to know where the bodies are and where people are when it comes to certain bills. I've been involved in every single immigration bill from the time that George Bush was president and Ted Kennedy asked me to be in that small group as a brand new senator with Lindsey Graham and others, to the Judiciary Committee, to this latest effort on Dreamers where we got gut punched by the administration, even though we had a bipartisan agreement. So I see this as just a combination of finding common ground when you can and standing your ground when you should.
Well, what other pieces of reform do you advocate that would be part of the comprehensive approach to immigration that you're talking about? I mean, some other hot-button topics would be the border wall, amnesty, pathway to citizenship. You mentioned DACA, and there are some among your competitors who advocate for a completely open border.
Yeah, no, I
So
have been clear that
how
that
do
is not me.
Right. How do you assess the problem of illegal immigration and all the ramifications that are created by that?
Well, first of all, the comprehensive immigration reform model from 2013 was not that different from what George Bush wanted, with some, I think, improvements. And what it really, at its core, is a path to citizenship for people who want to work here, who have obeyed the law and will obey the law. And it was an arduous path to citizenship. It took over a decade. And in the meantime, people could be documented workers. There was a cutoff date so that it wouldn't encourage people to come over, but it was a cutoff date for where you could apply from the past. And you would do the same thing with a comprehensive bill. And that bill, of course, was supported by Senator Grassley and many other Republicans. So that, to me, is the model. You would update it, make some changes, but you have something really good to start on, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Other pieces of that is
Like
it brings...
border security.
Border security. I think you listen to the experts, and it's border security that makes a difference. I don't think having a wall across that whole border makes any sense. Just like it doesn't make any sense at the Canadian border. And so what you need to do is listen to the experts about the kind of border security that we need for the asylum process. You can improve that. You could actually allow people to apply for asylum from those 3 Northern Triangle countries. And here's the key thing. I called Grover Norquist as a friendly witness for immigration reform back for the 2013 bill when I was the ranking Democrat on the Joint Economic Committee. A friendly witness. I called him because it brings the deficit down. This is a Congressional Budget Office score by $158 billion in 10 years. Because people come out of the shadows and pay their taxes, because people start small businesses. So it is at our peril if we forget to make that argument about this bill. So when you say, well, okay, so you need some more money if you do this, right? And by the way, that would be a drop into the bucket compared to the $158 billion, but you can use some of the money for border security, you can use some of the money to help with asylum cases and getting the judges and getting it right. You can Obviously, there's going to be some money to process the cases and vet people when they apply for citizenship. We know that, but think of the money that you're dealing with. And this is not me making this up or some liberal group. This is the Congressional Budget Office, and it was one of the motivating factors for some of the Republicans to be for this bill. So I just think you have to go back to the fact that 70 of our Fortune 500 companies are headed up by people from other countries. 25% of our U.S. Nobel laureates were born in other countries. Immigrants don't diminish America, they are America.
What was the figure you used? $158 billion.
$158 billion in deficit reduction in 10 years. And it's a Congressional Budget Office score. It would be updated now, I don't know, but it wouldn't be that far off. And then there was a 20-year, do you remember what that was? That's even bigger, of course, because it's 20 years. It was something, I don't want to get it wrong and get a Pinocchio.
But that,
But it was like, I think it was in the 700 billion. It was in the 700 billion range. I could think.
What you said is you look at this as an economic issue.
It's an economic issue, and I think that's the way you have to think about it. And I think one of the things that has worked some, like I argued to get the Liberians in Minnesota. We have the biggest Liberian population. We also have the biggest Somalian population. Oh, by the way, 10% of the undocumented in this country are from Asian countries. It is not only a border issue. We have immigrants in this country from all over the world. We know that. That's one of the strengths of our economy. But with the Liberians, they were legally here on temporary status. They are legally here. It's been going on a long time. And finally, after decades of trying, we got it in this last bill that they could have this permanent status. But we got to a day before they were going to be deported. They work in our nursing homes big time in Minnesota. They work in assisted living. They've helped my dad. And so many people in our country know that there are a number of people that are maybe dreamers or temporary status people, in addition to the undocumented population who are working in those areas. And many of them are working legally. he was literally going to deport them, and still is right now, with some of the groups that are out there that are here on temporary status. It just doesn't make any sense for our economy. So that would be part of it. And the difference is we had the first effort under Bush who really did want to get it done big time. I was in those meetings with Gutierrez, one of his secretaries, and Commerce, I think. We were trying to get that done. We were gut punched, actually, by right-wing radio. Then you got to the second effort, which was Obama's, and that was after the downturn, but that still failed in the House. It passed in the Senate, and the president would have supported it. The third effort was simply trying to save the Dreamers and the temporary status people. That was the bill that Mike Rollins headed up. And there were only 15 people in that room negotiating it, and I was one of them, and Tim Kaine was one of them. And so we ended up coming up with that compromise, and it was really a shock when we got punched the next day, honestly, by the administration. But at least that would have been, I came to believe, well, here at least during the era of Donald Trump, we can do one thing on this front, but we were unable to get it. So I think of it as there are major moral components of this. They are. We all know that we stand on the shoulders of immigrants, but there is also an economic need here because number one goal is to train our students and our workers so to fill the jobs that we have now so that they have good jobs and so our economy can function well. But it goes hand in hand with immigration reform because that is part of it as well. Partly because some of the people have the jobs now and we don't want them kicked out if they're following the law, and partly because we need workers in certain parts of these areas. But I don't want to neglect the job training, which I think is really important here too, to connect these economic plans that we have and education plans with what's best for our country. And to me, I am in favor of the 1- and 2-year degrees being free because those are the fastest growing areas that we have in our country. We're going to have over 1 million openings for home health care workers, some of whom don't even need a 1- and 2-year degree. We're going to have over 100,000 openings we cannot fill right now for nursing assistants. We're going to have over 70,000 openings for electricians in our country. We are not going to have a shortage of MBAs. We are going to have a shortage of plumbers. And so we have to look at what those areas are in our economy, and that leads you to encourage the 1- and 2-year degrees, and then also make sure that people take certain jobs, are able to get child care, things like that, and retirement. And then it also leads you to think, okay, let's make it easier for kids to afford college, but the smartest way to do it is to target aid with doubling Pell Grants and things like that instead of just making everything free for wealthy kids, which I don't favor.
Let's transition to healthcare. I don't know if that's the number one issue, but it's close to the number one issue. Mm-hmm. And the focus seems to be on, do we build upon the ACA, which there's some question about its future in the courts anyway, or do we scrap it and do something different? Some people suggest the single payer, the Medicare for all. You're more of the public option, building upon the ACA. So how would your healthcare plan look? Mm-hmm. What do you think are the shortcomings of the ACA that your plan would help to address?
Well, I see the ACA as the Affordable Care Act as a beginning and not an end. I said that the day that it passed because I, in my mind, having worked on some of the pharmaceutical issues, was well aware that there was not really anything in that bill to make pharma prices more competitive and that we had to do a lot more. But I always believe, as I woke up looking at your river, that if you come to water, you try to build a bridge to get over some troubled waters instead of blowing one up. And so that is why I do not think the best thing to do is to kick 149 million Americans off their current health insurance in 4 years. I'm one of the few members of Congress that has been in this race, as some people have been in and got out. I think there's just very few, and I'm the only one on the debate stage that's still in the Senate that did not get on that bill, and that's because I read it, and I read what it said on page 8. I think the better approach is to build on it with a nonprofit public option that would help to cover more people, and it would also bring down the cost of health care for everyone. And then it would keep in place a lot of the protections from the Affordable Care Act, like not kicking people off their insurance for pre-existing conditions. And I actually did a debate on this with Senator Graham and Senator Cassidy. I was paired up with Bernie several years ago when they were trying to repeal the Affordable Care Act. And Bernie and I, clearly from the debate stage, have different views, but we did agree on the fact that you shouldn't kick people off of their health insurance for pre-existing conditions. The second thing that we need to do is to look at things like reinsurance and cost sharing. I think those are some sensible things that have Republican and Democratic support to improve the bill. The third thing, as I mentioned, is take on pharmaceutical prices. Senator Grassley and I have paired up on two bills that I think would be very helpful. The first is to bring in less expensive drugs from other countries that are safe. We can see Canada from our porch in Minnesota, and we see those prices over the border, and there's no reason that we shouldn't be able to spur on some competition in our country by doing that. So that's a bill I had with Senator McCain, and when Senator McCain died, Senator Grassley was willing to step in his shoes and lead that bill with me. We did do a late-night vote on a very similar version of this at one point, and we got 14 Republican senator votes on that bill. So I have every reason to believe that we could actually pass this bill in a real vote. Another bill we have is stop the practice of pay for delay. And that is where big pharma companies pay off generics to keep their products off the market. So both generics and pharma like it, and who loses are consumers. That would bring in a couple $2 billion for taxpayers over 10 years. Other things, lifting the prohibition right now on Medicare negotiating for less expensive drugs for seniors. Pharma got that in there, and I have 34 senators on that bill right now. I lead that bill to lift that prohibition. So these are all examples of things you can do, and the bill that Grassley and I have, I could actually do that myself as president. That's one of the things we found out. I have 137 things that a president can do without Congress on a list that are legal, and that's one of them. Because I really believe you have to jumpstart the work on prescription drugs and other things in order to build trust with the American people, because nothing has happened.
How frustrating is it for you when you go through all of this, research, meetings, whatever it might be, and then the president can just dismiss it with a tweet, and the public is not even in your camp. They don't even consider what you had to say. How do you deal with that?
Oh, well, I mean, once you're the nominee, that will be way different. And I think one of the best arguments against the president is some of these promises that he made that he has not kept to the American people. And one of them is clearly on pharmaceutical prices. He is in a very strong position to get this done, and he hasn't done it. I think other things with healthcare would be mental health and opioids, and remembering that there are other forms of addiction as well, like meth and crack cocaine, and still alcoholism that we could deal with. And this is personal for me. My dad struggled with alcoholism despite being a very successful journalist, and he had his third DWI by the time I was in getting married, and by then the laws had changed, and the judge said to him, "You've got jail or treatment," and he picked treatment, and it changed his life. And as a result of that, he's been sober now for decades. He's 91. He's in assisted living. His AA group still visits them in assisted living, and as he said about a year ago, it's hard to get a drink around here anyway. But the point of the story is that it changed his life, and I think everyone should have that same right, in his words, because of his faith and his family and his treatment, to be pursued by grace. And to me, that means I have, from the very beginning, been involved in the opioid bill as one of 4 senators leading the bipartisan effort. And from there, I think there's going to be major settlements coming out of these lawsuits. And I think the money, if you have a president that can do this, make sure that the money goes where it belongs, to areas that have high addiction rates, but also that it goes to other forms of addictions, because it would be really stupid to add more treatment beds and have it only be for one thing. To not include mental health when Iowa only has 64 public mental health beds in your state. The other thing, and last thing I just want to say about merging off of health care, because we keep relitigating the Affordable Care Act, even though it is now 10 points more popular than the president. Because we keep relitigating that, we have neglected the biggest issue in the room, and that is long-term care. We're seeing a doubling of our senior population, and that's a good thing. People are living longer, but we really haven't done anything in long-term care. Obviously, you keep Social Security strong, but beyond that, we should be doing more to incentivize people to buy long-term care insurance and also making it easier for people to stay at home. And we have made no changes to this whole structure. And there are some really smart things we can do to incentivize people to get more long-term care insurance. I know with my own dad, he was smart enough to get that long-term care insurance at a time where he could, one, afford it, which not everyone can do, and two, it was easier to get. And now I know exactly when that ends because he's in this house with 16 people. It works ideally for him with his situation, but it's going to end. He doesn't have that much in savings. He had 3 marriages, whole nother story. And so I know when that ends, and then Medicaid kicks in, and Catholic Charities said they'd take them in. But a lot of families are facing that choice even sooner. And so I think that trying to do all we can to make this work. It's cheaper for everyone if people stay in their homes or find housing in town and things like that. That frees up housing for families and others that might want to move into houses that seniors are in. There's just all kinds of things we should be looking at. And I've worked extensively with AARP. You also have at the other end, a lot of seniors want to work or part-time or they want to volunteer. And we should also make that easier as well because we need workers.
A lot of talk during the campaign about spending money.
Mm-hmm.
We have a $20 trillion plus debt in our country. We deficit spend every year, $1 trillion annual deficits. How worried are you about that tsunami of red ink? And what would a President Klobuchar do to address that problem, which clearly isn't sustainable for the long term?
Oh, I'm very worried about it. I actually mentioned it in my announcement in the middle of that blizzard in the Mississippi River. And I am one of the few candidates that actually has something in my economic plans on the Democratic side, which is focused on the debt. I think this has been exacerbated by the president, and I know it's not solely the fault of one party, but that tax bill, which had some things in it that I supported, really added over $1 trillion in debt. And I don't like it when he doesn't seem to focus on that at all with whatever it is, defense spending, you name it. And I think that as president, you need someone who's going to come in. It seems like it's always been the president that has to be the one that says, okay, what are we going to do? I supported the formation of the Debt Commission and was one of the senators that held back my vote on one of the budget votes so that that commission could start. I think they had some good ideas. I didn't agree with all of them, but they had some good ideas in there. And sadly, that report is just sitting on a shelf along with the Domenici-Rivlin report. This is back a while. But there were some things that we needed to look at there. I would immediately start a deficit payback plan, and it would start with rolling back 2 percentage points of the corporate tax cuts. I did favor bringing the corporate tax rate down when we were having those discussions, but I think that it went way too far down in terms of what our country could sustain for the debt. So even if you take 2 points of that, that gives you $200 billion over 10 years. Then I would direct my...
2% of the 2017 bill?
Yeah, 2 points of it. Every point they went down from the mid-30s to 21% was $100 billion. Okay, and I would take 4 of those percent and put it into infrastructure, which he should have done to begin with because there was ample appetite to move on infrastructure back then, honestly, and there still is. But anyway, so if you take that $200 billion and then you couple it with some spending changes and cuts, I would actually instruct my cabinet members to come up with there. There's not one analysis of the Pentagon budget that doesn't find duplicative spending and start out with $1 billion that way. There are other $100 billion that way. There are other things that you can do as well, but I think it is a beginning. And as my friend Angus King, the independent senator from Maine, has said, it took us decades to walk into this woods. It's a good Maine analogy, and it's going to take us decades to walk out. But you have to at least have a president that's willing to talk about it. The way I talked about immigration reform, it's the last thing in the discussion item or never brought up by many people, but I think it should be in the top three because we have to look at every one of these policies. Last thing I would add is an interesting idea that's been put forward by Senator Jean Shaheen of New Hampshire and Senator Isaacson, who just retired, of Georgia, and I'm sure I would guess there's other Republicans on the bill that will fill his space, but it is his place. But it is biannual budgeting, and the idea is to, right now in Congress, what we do is we do the budget every year. So we do a budget, and then the end of the year comes, but sometimes it doesn't even get done until the very end or so. And then they go, oh, we're out of time, so I guess we'll just extend that last budget, or we'll make a few minor changes. And so it leads to no one predictability, but which is bad for things like whatever you want, energy, you name it. But number two, there's never time for any oversight over how the agencies are spending the money. So their idea, and I'm a co-sponsor of this, their idea is to say, okay, let's pass a budget, get that in place in the first year, start spending the money. Then in the second year, let's start reviewing it to see if the money's actually being spent or how it's spent or if it's working. I love this idea because it puts Congress back in the role of the actual oversight that we should be doing, and it also is going to show when things aren't really being spent the right way and what we can do, and allowing us to move money over to things that we could spend money on. I think also, honestly, creating more of an incentive for them to do their work and show their receipts, literally, for what they've gotten done. So I like that plan.
The devil's advocate would say it's not a taxing. You mentioned reducing the corporate tax by 2% over what it was, what was in the 2017 bill. Devil's advocate would say this isn't a tax problem; it's a spending problem. We spend too much money.
I think you're the devil's advocate.
I am.
No.
I am the devil's
I didn't say you're the. I said you're the. I added that advocate.
I am the devil's advocate with this question. Yes.
Okay.
Because if you are the nominee, you'll have to transition to the general election campaign, and more of those questions, I suspect, would be asked
of course.
than perhaps are being asked
yes.
now.
Yes.
What will you say to those people who say they just spend too much money?
Yeah. Well,
they tax me too much, and they spend too much.
Okay, so I would first point to who my opponent will be, which is Donald Trump, who has treated the people of this country like poker chips in one of his bankrupt casinos. I mean, he has, at a time when the economy actually has been more stable because of the work of our workers and businesses over the last decade since that downturn, and instead of dealing with the challenges ahead of him, he has just been relishing in the work, which I believe people did, including in this community, to get us out of that downturn. So what are the challenges? We went over one of them, immigration reform, workforce training. Another is dealing with the debt. And so I don't think that he has done that. And I think I will have a case to make on the numbers. So that would be my first response. The second is, yes, of course you look at spending. That's why I'm such a fan of this biannual budgeting, which I've acknowledged that there is duplicative spending. And when you look at some of my work in the past, I have been someone who has advocated for the debt commission and for other things. And so there you go.
What about entitlement reform? Entitlements are such a huge part of the budget, and they're going to become an even bigger part as baby boomers continue to retire at enormous numbers. What are your thoughts on the addition of that component to this discussion, reforming of entitlements?
Given the fact that some of this money went to the people at the top, and there's no doubt about it, I think that we have to be careful that we don't make it harder for people who are having trouble affording things. So we probably aren't going to agree about this, but what I would do on Social Security to make it solvent going forward is to lift the cap. Right now, the tax for Social Security goes up to $133,000 in income. I would actually there's a bill that does this, a donut hole, and start it again at $250,000. That would actually keep us solvent because right now it's going to, by 2034, it's going to be paying out 10 to 15% less.
I actually agree.
You do?
You said you disagree. I actually agree with that.
Okay.
I think there are some
Yeah.
common sense
Right.
reforms
Right.
that are just demagogue from
Right.
the get-go that
Yeah.
actually make sense.
Right.
That it's hard to argue
Exactly.
why those are not good ideas.
I think there is delivery system reform that we just started with in the Affordable Care Act when it comes to things like Medicare. I was a big advocate of that. The northern tier of states, including Minnesota and Iowa in our country, tend to be more quality focused on healthcare and also tend to be less expensive. There is less running around to doctors. There's more organized healthcare. And so I have always been a big fan of that. I think you actually get better results. We're the home of the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. Not perfect, but I think it is one of the models you can look at for organized care. I think looking at rural health care and understanding that it's different than other kinds of health care, but delivery system reform has already delivered some, at least bending, as I call it, bending the cost curve. Worst words to ever use in a political debate, but those are the words, and made some changes with these accountable care organizations. But I think there's even more we can do. And unfortunately, the administration has been sabotaging the Affordable Care Act, making it harder to deliver on these delivery system reforms. Bringing down the cost of pharmaceuticals would make a huge difference. I mentioned the bills that Grassley and I have. Well, there's one in the House right now that would put a cap tied to the international average on common drugs like insulin. CBO score, $350 billion in taxpayer relief in just 10 years. Imagine also the relief to consumers. I bring that up. It's not just because it's a big issue with consumers. It's actually, when you include hospital pharmas, it is nearly 20% of our total healthcare costs. So think about this rampant area where nothing has been done when you look at healthcare. That would greatly help with Medicare. So
Should seniors be worried?
yeah, they should if we don't do anything to shore this up. It's also not just seniors. It is people who are in what I call the sandwich generation, who are trying to take care of their parents who they love and their own kids. It is caregivers when 14 million people are going to have Alzheimer's by 2050, and it's the most expensive disease, making sure that we figure out the best way to do this. And these things are, I used to call this the silver tsunami, and then AARP told me that was too negative, so I call it the silver surge. But we're going to just see more and more seniors, and it means everything with our housing, our workforce. It can be an advantage with the workforce if we're smart about this, because we have a lot of healthy seniors, as I mentioned, that want to work, volunteer, training the community on how to deal with Alzheimer's. That's something the Alzheimer's Association is doing right now when people are still in the community but show up at a store and are forgetful. There's a lot of really cool things that we can do that actually will advance our economy and what we do as
I
a
see
whole.
them
Housing.
start to shudder when it gets to the talk about Social Security, where they say we need to do Social Security
They
reform.
support, I don't want to say they, it's a broad thing, but there's a lot of support for that proposal I just gave that he and I and my devil's advocate had the meeting of the minds on.
So-
There's a lot of support for that. And remember, it is still solvent until 2034.
Senator,
Mhm.
I've noticed 3-4 times you've mentioned Senator Grassley from Iowa.
Yeah.
And bipartisan pieces that you've done. A lot of lawmakers or candidates are resistant to labels, but I just want to ask you, in using that nomenclature, are you a moderate Democrat? And there's lanes.
Yeah.
Are you progressive, populist,
Yes.
moderate? Are you
Okay.
Wellstonian?
Well, part of this is I really don't like labels because I think I'm a proven progressive, which means you make progress. You have to prove you're going to make progress. To me, that means making progress. It means having people's back. I think I've been classified as being in the moderate lane in this primary. That's all fine, that's fine. But I think you can also have someone who is moderate in tone, which I think is really important right now because I don't think the people are looking for the loudest voice in the White House. I am proud of the work that I've done across the aisle. I am someone that doesn't believe that courage is standing in the Senate chamber by yourself, making a speech, imploding, and going after other people. I think courage is whether or not you're willing to stand next to someone that you don't always agree with for the betterment of this country. That's courage to me. And I think that, I've shown it in my own work. And that does not mean that I agree with Senator Grassley on everything. We vociferously disagree on a number of things. But it does mean that I will find ways to work with him. By the way, another example that we haven't talked about is ag and the biofuels work. We have led that together. So when the waivers started coming across our tables and we started to realize what is going on because they were done in a very non-transparent way, we led the effort to write the administration and say what is going on. And that's when we started discovering that this, that worked fine, that process, when the waiver process, and still could when you had 6 or 7 or, waivers a year for small refineries. That's not what this turned into. This turned into a complete undermining of the renewable fuel standard to over 70 waivers to the point where they're going to Chevron and Exxon, which is one of the things that we discovered. And the year-round E15 is a good thing, but it's been undercut by these waivers, which were done behind closed doors. So I always felt it kind of amusing that then Secretary Pruitt, who'd been under attack for many good reasons, including ethics, didn't have to resign until he came to Iowa. Then it was like pitchforks out. But sadly, then it didn't improve after he left, and there were 31 more waivers granted after the president went to the ethanol plant that I visited with Congresswoman Axney in Council Bluffs.
As you've gone through the 99 counties in Iowa, you just mentioned RFS. How often do people in town halls or in meet and greets, how often do they bring up the RFS?
Mm-hmm.
How often do they bring up the steel tariffs and what the impact is?
Yeah. So people bring this up a lot depending on where you are. And I visited like the plant in Crawfordsville, which is a biodiesel plant that closed down. And I'll never forget that because there was one worker left, one guy who is left manning the plant to keep the equipment maintained, and he brings out a coat rack of the uniforms of his former coworkers with their names right there embroidered on: Salvador, Mark, Derek. And he says, these are my friends, and they can't work here anymore because of really 2 things: the waivers, and then also what was going on with the trade war, which had an effect on some of the biodiesel because of the soybeans. So I'll get to that in a minute. But people do bring it up, and I've always believed we should be investing in the farmers and the workers of the Midwest instead of the oil cartels of the Mideast. Minnesota has a major history of the renewable fuel standard on a state basis, and you will find in my record strongly advocating for ag, but also strongly advocating in rural communities, strongly advocating for biofuels. So it does come up. I have gotten the endorsement in the last few elections in Minnesota of both the Farmers Union and the Farm Bureau. And it's not because they agreed with me on every issue, but they knew that I was understood rural issues and had their backs. On the farm ag front, I look at each trade agreement and say, is this good or not? And I voted for some and didn't vote for others. I voted, for instance, for South Korea. It wasn't perfect, but I voted for it in part because of the export issues for a lot of our ag products out of the middle of the country. I am the only one on the debate stage that was willing to stand up and say I was for USMCA with the changes in the last debate in Los Angeles. That doesn't mean that other people haven't since said they were for it, but I was the one that raised my hand because I wanted to make that point, and I will be voting on it. Bernie and I had a disagreement on that. I actually think some of the changes that were made were good changes. The changes that allowed for inspections of the plants, particularly in Mexico, but of all plants, that was a good thing, and that's going to bring more people in. Richard Trumka, the head of the AFL-CIO, is supporting this agreement, and so is the chamber. And that will I think, lay some groundwork for other agreements. There is better environmental standards in there. They got rid of the sweetheart deal for pharma. One weird fact about me that people don't know is I am head of the Canadian American Interparliamentarian Group. I haven't said it on the debate stage because it would take up the whole 30 seconds. But I have led many trips there, including after the G7 with Senator Blunt and Senator Crapo to go and meet with the Canadians. At one point, the Canadians were not going to be included in the agreement. Remember this time period? And I actually gathered 15 senators, including Senator Portman and Toomey and others, to go over to the Canadian Embassy for a lengthy discussion and dinner to go over some of these issues so that we could help to try to get Canada back in the agreement. We thought that was really important. So that's the most recent trade issue, but I actually think this is something of a model as we look at the potential European trade agreement and other potential agreements in Asia and the like going forward.
I always look to the staff for this question. How are we on time? Do we
Yeah.
have a little something we want to do with the, pardon me?
15 minutes.
All right, then, I know we have a little something.
You
we
could
wanna
have said
do.
like 3. No, I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I know we have a little something we want to do at the end, so I
Uh-huh.
want to leave time for that. But I wanted to make sure I asked about climate change, because I know that's a big issue, an important issue for you and other candidates in the race as well. And how do you address people who say, well, too much attention to climate change will hurt our domestic economy, people will lose jobs, and how do you get a country like China to help us protect the climate?
Exactly.
We shouldn't have to do it all by ourselves. How do you get them to move along with us in the same direction?
Yeah.
Your-
So my
your
first
constituents.
answer is to really turn that question on its head a bit and say, what will happen if we don't do anything economically? Because we now know it's not happening 100 years from now, it's happening now. And I think the best argument is right here. The best argument is what we're starting to see, which all the scientists predicted and the military predicted. I was on the committee, the Environmental Transportation Committee, for a number of years, and the military came in and predicted that you would see these wildfires in the western part of our country, like we've seen rampant in California and in Colorado and even Arizona. And they predicted that we would see weird weather events in the middle of the country and that we would see more flooding. And so right now, socking it to a lot of people, we're seeing a 50% increase in homeowners insurance. If you talk to anyone in the insurance industry, and you have a vibrant one in Iowa, you should talk to them about it. Their insurance rates are going up in part because of the flooding and the fires and what we're seeing all over the country in big ways. So it's already affecting people economically. The flooding that we're seeing is affecting our planting and harvests and things like that because the ground is so wet. Again, all things that were predicted. The levees that burst, that infrastructure is being tested like it's never been tested. So how do I address, well, what about, isn't this going to be expensive? First of all, the answer is if we do nothing, it's going to be so expensive you won't even believe it because it's going to change people's livelihoods and wipe out entire towns. So that's the first answer. The second is we can do this in a way that's going to keep our economy strong. Iowa particularly, and Minnesota and some of our Midwest states that see the gain you can get from renewable energy, from wind that you've already seen here. Someone called you guys the Saudi Arabia of wind, which is what North Dakota calls themselves too, but we'll just take this thing. You got wind, you've got wind manufacturing that we could see more. You've got solar coming in a big way and potential solar manufacturing, electric grid that can be built, all kinds of things where we could actually see benefits. I mean, this is the state of Norman Borlaug, who didn't take no for an answer, who was given a problem, which was the parts of the world people were starving and dying, and used science and technology to develop better seeds and the like to help people to support themselves. I would say the same thing about this challenge. So how I would propose to get at it is the first is kind of obvious, things that president can do without Congress. Getting back into the International Climate Change Agreement. When Trump got us out, it was only Nicaragua and Syria that were not in it. They are now in it. It's going to be really hard for us to lead economically and sell our products that I hope we will develop and know we will if we're not in that agreement, if we don't be part of the solution. And we have no much leverage with China or any other country if we're not in there, number one. Number two, clean power rules. That was developed and compromised on during the Obama administration. We were at a point where a lot of companies like Excel, which is in Minnesota and in the West, have said they can more than meet those standards. It's harder for some of our smaller co-ops. I have a big understanding of that because I got a lot of them. And the way they did it state by state, I think you can make it work with them on a bit of a different timetable. Gas mileage standards. That was something all the car companies were ready to agree to. Ford still wants to do it, but Trump dialed that back, and I think that was a big mistake. Those are three things that you can do without Congress.
That would be
Then,
raising required MPG, basically?
yeah, and that was announced. Remember, they all agreed to it, the car companies, U.S., and because they saw it as a competitive advantage to them, and then he dialed it back. Now California is trying to do it. Ford is still on board along with two other companies, and what happens? He threatens them with antitrust violations for working with California. This is all documented. I'm the ranking on antitrust, so I know a lot about this. The last thing you do is legislation, and that's got to be a combination of energy efficiency and making clear what these tax incentives are, and then putting a price on carbon. Economists would tell you the best way to do it is with a carbon fee or tax. That's one way, and I am open to it. Another way is doing a national renewable electricity standard. You could have various ways to meet it in different regions. The third way is some version of cap and trade, or you do a combination of these in some way. But the point is you have to put a price on carbon. Then what's going to happen? Well, it's going to bring in a lot of money, and it's going to bring in a lot of incentives to do different kinds of energy. But you have to make sure the people that see a shift in their energy bills, and there will be people that see that, are made whole, especially people who can't afford it. And so every proposal out there envisions this dividend that, and I won't say every, there's probably some proposal that doesn't, but most mainstream proposals that want to get to carbon neutral by 2050 envision that there's going to be a dividend back to people at some level of income, whether it's over the median income. And so you do that, and then you also help the areas that are going to see a transition in jobs. Some are going to see more jobs, but some are going to see less jobs. So you have to make sure you create incentives, not just for green energy jobs, but for manufacturing jobs to come in. I don't just think this in my head. I will be the candidate that will feel it in my heart because my grandpa was an iron ore miner. He worked 1,500 feet underground in the mines his whole life. He wanted to be in the Navy, but he had to raise his 9 brothers and sisters. He was the oldest son. His parents died really, really young. And then he also raised my dad and his brother by saving money in a coffee can in the basement of their little house up in Ely, Minnesota. As a result of that, I saw mines close and open, close and open. I remember still the billboard outside of Duluth when I was growing up that said, "Last one to leave, turn off the lights." So when you grow up with something like that and you see it in your own family when the mines close, you know that you have to think about that when you're developing public policy. By the way, you asked about the steel tariffs. Along those same lines, just recently we were seeing an inordinate number of amount of steel dumping by China. And before Trump got in there, I brought up the chief of staff to President Obama up to the range. We met with the steelworkers, we met with the mine owners, and they completely ramped up their efforts for enforcement. And it opened the mines without using a meat cleaver or tweed cleaver. It did. The mines started to open, they started to expand because they needed the steel when we had less of the illegal steel dumping going on. I tell that story because I am very aware that the effects of these policies affect regular people.
How do you reach those people who really like Donald Trump?
Okay. For the people that are at his rallies, I probably can't reach them. I know that. And there's a certain percentage of people that are going to be voting for Donald Trump, most likely, no matter what. But there are a whole bunch of people in the middle that, as I said at the beginning, For them, this isn't a economic check. It is for some of them when we talked about these issues of biofuels and other things, and especially in the ag economy, it is. But it is also a whole group of people where it's a decency check. It's a values check. It's a patriotism check. It's about a president that stands next to Vladimir Putin and is asked by a reporter about Russian interference, invasion in our election, which, by the way, wasn't with a tank or a missile, but it was with a cyber attack. And he turns to him and makes a joke. That's what our president did on the world stage. When all world leaders are watching, he makes a joke. It's not a joke. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have lost their lives on the battlefield standing up for democracies, including during World War II. 4 little girls lost their lives in a bombing in a church in Alabama because people were trying to take democracy away from them, and they were innocents in that fight for civil rights. So it is at our peril if we screw this up, because if we don't reach out to those voters, I don't think we win in any big way. Maybe we eke out a victory at 4 in the morning. But these are people like the cattle rancher in Minnesota who, a few years into Trump's presidency, I went on a tour of his ranch on this ATV, which I thought, what a bad way to die, because we were like there are these huge cows and we run. But then he took me back in his house and he said, you know what, we voted for Donald Trump. And I said, what do you mean, the cattle ranchers, or you mean your family? He said, no, I don't like to talk about myself. He said, I mean myself. I said, we voted for Donald Trump because we were mad about health care. And then he said, and then I saw him standing in front of that wall. And I said, the wall wasn't built. No. He said, no, the wall of the CIA agents. Because he saw him the day after the inauguration give a partisan speech in front of that wall of all the stars of the deceased CIA agents who anonymously lost their lives in the line of duty. And Trump gave a speech about the crowd size, a partisan speech. And for that guy, that was a big moment. And he said, then the Boy Scout speech. He said, I was a Boy Scout, like my husband. He said, I was a Boy Scout. And when he gave that partisan speech in front of all those Boy Scouts, that was it for me. I decided it was about patriotism. Or the guy in a line in Conway, New Hampshire, where they're all wearing these stickers that said, like, I'm a climate change voter, I'm a this voter, I'm a that voter. And the one guy comes up, he's got this brown jacket. And I said, you're not wearing a sticker, sir, teasing him. And he goes, that's because I was a Trump voter. And he said, and they don't know. These are my neighbors, they don't know. But I'm not doing it again. So at our peril do we forget these people. And I always remind people of that young man who grew up in Primgar, Iowa, who was the son of immigrants, who rose up to become the counsel of the United States Army. And when no one would stand up to Joseph McCarthy during those McCarthy hearings, no one would be willing to say the emperor has no clothes. When he was going after people, say what political group they belong in, even if they didn't, and blacklisting them from getting a job. One guy did. It was that guy, the Army Counsel, Joseph Welch. And he is the one that said, have you no sense of decency, sir? Have you no sense of decency? So this election is not just about economics. This election is also about the future of our country, how we treat each other, and what patriotism really is. And there's a whole bunch of people that don't agree with everything I say and what some of those candidates say on the stage, but they believe that our country is bigger than the guy in the White House.